Hey guys, tonight we're traveling somewhere a little different. We're heading to a traditional Chinese village, the kind that existed for centuries before cities swallowed the countryside and smartphones replaced actual conversation. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture a village in rural China, maybe somewhere in Anhui province, or tucked into the rice terraces of Guangxi, or nestled in the foggy hills of Sichuan. The exact location doesn't matter much because for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years, life in these villages followed remarkably similar patterns. The same festivals marked the seasons. The same crops demanded attention. The same complaints about weather echoed through courtyards. This wasn't a place of dramatic innovation or rapid change. It was a place of comfortable, predictable repetition, which, if you think about it, is exactly what we're looking for tonight. The village sits between rice paddies and low hills, connected to the outside world by a single dirt road that transforms into an impassable mud river every time the heavens decide to open up. There are maybe 80 to 100 families here, depending on how generous you are with the definition of family. The houses are built from whatever materials the land provides: wood, brick, stone, bamboo, and centuries of accumulated repair work that's left each structure looking like a architectural palimpsest. The homes cluster together like they're seeking warmth from each other, separated by narrow alleyways barely wide enough for a person and an opinionated chicken to pass without negotiation. Your house, assuming you're fortunate enough to own one, rather than rent from a wealthier family, follows the traditional courtyard design, not the grand palatial courtyards you'd see in period dramas about emperors and concubines. This is the economy version, the sensible version, a modest, open space in the middle, maybe 10 feet across, surrounded by rooms on 3 or possibly 4 sides, depending on your family's prosperity and building ambitions. The courtyard serves as your kitchen, your social space, your laundry area, your occasional chicken coop, when the rooster decides property rights are a suggestion rather than a rule, and your general purpose, everything room. The architecture follows principles that locals call Feng Shui, which sounds mystical and profound until you realize it's mostly common sense wrapped in philosophical terminology to make it sound more impressive. Face your house south to maximize sunlight during winter and minimize it during summer. Don't build where water naturally pools unless you enjoy having a moat you didn't ask for. Position your kitchen away from sleeping areas so smoke doesn't asphyxiate you in your sleep. Keep your front door aligned with something pleasant rather than pointing at a neighbor's waste pit. This is practical wisdom accumulated through generations of trial, error, and probably a fair number of architectural disasters nobody talks about anymore. The walls are thick, not because medieval insulation technology was impressive, but because thick walls made from rammed earth or brick happen to work reasonably well at keeping the interior temperature somewhat stable. In summer, they stay cool. In winter, they stay cold, but slightly less cold than outside. It's not central heating, but it's better than nothing. Which is the alternative? Your bed, The place where you'll spend roughly a third of your life, if you're lucky enough to live that long, is remarkably firm. In northern regions, it might be a kang, which is essentially a brick platform built over a hollow space. During winter, the kitchen fire heats, flues running underneath this platform, turning your bed into a giant warm brick. It's ingenious. It's also unforgiving if you're used to mattresses that conform to your body rather than expecting your body to conform to them. In southern regions, where winters are less brutal and heating a brick bed seems excessive, you might have a wooden bed frame strung with bamboo strips or wooden planks, topped with a thin mat woven from bamboo or reeds. The mattress, if we're generous enough to call it that, consists of a cotton padded quilt folded and placed on the bed surface. It's about as soft as a folded towel. Your pillow is a small rectangular block filled with rice husks, buckwheat hulls, or sometimes just densely packed cotton. It's firm, very firm, the kind of firm that makes you understand why traditional Chinese medicine has so many remedies for neck pain. These pillows rustle and crinkle every time you move your head, providing a gentle soundtrack to your evening regrets and midnight repositioning. Privacy, as a concept, exists in theory, but rarely in practice. If you have your own sleeping room, congratulations. You're either very wealthy or you're the designated person nobody wants to sleep near because of your snoring. Most families sleep together in one or two rooms. Children with parents. Sometimes grandparents squeezed in as well. Possibly an unmarried uncle who hasn't figured out his life yet. The only privacy you get comes from everyone agreeing to pretend they can't hear you breathing, talking in your sleep, or making any of the other sounds that humans involuntarily produce during the night. This system works surprisingly well through sheer collective commitment to polite ignorance. Now let's talk about your day, because in a traditional Chinese village, your day doesn't really belong to you. It belongs to the sun, which dictates when you wake and when you rest. It belongs to the season, which determines what work needs doing. And it belongs to several thousand years of agricultural tradition that have very strong, very specific opinions about when things should happen and in what order. You wake early, not because you've set an alarm or because you're naturally a morning person. You wake because the rooster has decided that dawn is happening right now, and he's going to make absolutely certain everyone within a half-mile radius knows about it. His crow isn't a polite suggestion. It's a territorial declaration, a mating advertisement, and a general announcement of his existence, all rolled into one penetrating sound that seems specifically designed to wake the dead. You don't need an alarm clock when you have poultry with opinions. You stumble out of bed, your joints creaking in harmony with the wooden floorboards. Everything hurts a little bit. Your back from yesterday's farm work, your legs from squatting and standing and walking, your hands from whatever repetitive task occupied them for hours. You're probably somewhere between 20 and 50 years old, which in traditional village terms covers everything from young adult to elderly, depending on how hard your life has been. And if you've been a farmer, which statistically you almost certainly are, your life has been hard in ways that would horrify modern ergonomists. First order of business, washing your face. This isn't the casual splash of warm water from a convenient faucet that modern people enjoy. You walk to the courtyard where a large ceramic jar sits, filled with water that was carried from the village well yesterday, or possibly the day before. The water is cold, not cool, not refreshing, cold. In winter, it's cold enough to make you question your life choices and possibly reconsider whether being awake is actually necessary. You scoop water with a wooden ladle or your cupped hands and splash it on your face anyway because everyone else is doing it, and nobody wants to be the one person who can't handle a little ice water at dawn. The shock wakes you up more effectively than any amount of caffeine ever could. Next, you visit the toilet. Let's not dwell on this longer than necessary, but it requires acknowledgement. The toilet is a small structure at the edge of your courtyard or shared with neighbors. It's basically a wooden seat built over a pit, or in some cases, a large ceramic jar that will need emptying eventually. The smell is distinctive, pungent, a potent reminder that indoor plumbing is one of civilization's greatest achievements, and you do not have it. You do your business quickly, trying not to think too deeply about the fact that this same facility contributes to the fertilizer that grows the vegetables you'll eat later. The circle of life is beautiful in theory, and somewhat less appealing in practice. Breakfast time. The morning meal is simple, consistent, and has probably been the same for generations. Rice porridge, congee, if you want to use the proper term. It's rice boiled with so much water that it becomes a thick, warm, slightly sticky soup. The texture lands somewhere between liquid and solid, achieving a consistency that's oddly comforting once you're used to it. The porridge is cooked in a large pot over the kitchen fire, which was started before dawn by whoever drew the short straw for morning fire duty. The fire itself deserves its own discussion. It's not a convenient gas stove or an electric burner. It's an actual fire, burning wood, charcoal, or dried grass depending on what's available and affordable. The stove is a brick structure with a metal wok balanced on top. Smoke rises, some of it making its way out through gaps in the roof, some of it just hanging around in the kitchen like an unwanted guest who does not understand social cues. Your eyes water. Everyone's eyes water. It's just part of breakfast. After a few years, you develop a permanent squint that becomes your normal facial expression. The porridge might have accompaniments if you're lucky. Pickled vegetables usually. Small cubes or strips of radish, cucumber, or mustard greens that have been preserved in salt and spices. They're intensely salty and sour, the kind of flavor that wakes up your entire mouth at once. Maybe there's a preserved egg called Paddies or century egg, despite not actually being a century old. It's a duck egg, preserved in clay, ash, salt, and lime until the white turns dark and translucent, and the yolk becomes creamy and slightly sulfurous. To the uninitiated, it looks like something that went terribly wrong. To those raised with it, it's a delicacy. To you, eating breakfast in this traditional village, it's just food. Everyone eats quickly, sitting on small wooden stools in the courtyard if weather permits, or inside if it doesn't. Chopsticks click against ceramic bowls. Slurping is not just acceptable, but practically required. It's how you know someone is properly enjoying their meal. Conversation is minimal this early. People are awake, but not quite conscious yet. Questions are limited to practical matters. Is there enough firewood? Did someone check if the chickens laid eggs? Who's taking the pig to the field today? The pig, by the way, is not a pet. It's an investment, a future meal, and currently a garbage disposal system that follows whoever feeds it. After breakfast, the real work begins. And by real work, we mean the kind of back-breaking labor that makes you understand why your ancestors were statistically shorter and why everyone over 30 moves like they're negotiating with their skeleton to keep functioning. If you're a farmer, which again, you probably are, because roughly 80% of the village works in agriculture, your relationship with rice paddies is about to become extremely intimate. Rice cultivation isn't romantic. It's not the peaceful watercolor painting that decorates restaurant walls. It's wet, it's muddy, and it involves spending hours bent over at an angle that would make modern physical therapists weep openly. The work varies by season, but let's say it's planting season. You wade into the paddy, which is a carefully maintained field flooded with several inches of water. The water is cold in early spring, body temperature warm in summer, and always full of things you'd rather not think about too carefully. Mud squelches between your toes. Small creatures swim past your ankles. Leeches are just part of the ecosystem. You learn to check your legs periodically and flick them off with the casual indifference of someone who's done this thousands of times. You're holding bundles of rice seedlings, young plants that were germinated in a separate nursery bed and are now ready for transplanting. Your job is to plant these seedlings in neat rows, spacing them appropriately so each plant has room to grow, but not so much room that you're wasting valuable field space. This requires bending at the waist, plunging your hands into the muddy water, pressing each seedling into the soil, and then shuffling backward or sideways to the next position. Bend, plant, step, repeat, bend, plant, step, repeat, over and over and over. Your back begins to ache within the first hour. By the second hour, the ache has evolved into active pain. By the third hour, you've transcended pain and entered a kind of numb acceptance. This is your life now. You are a rice planting machine made of human parts that would all very much like to file complaints with management. But there is no management. There's just rice. Endless rice. Rice that needs planting today because the season waits for no one. And if you delay, your harvest suffers. And if your harvest suffers, your family goes hungry next winter. Motivation through practical desperation. Around you, the entire village is engaged in similar labor. The paddies stretch in every direction, terraced on hillsides or spread across valleys, all of them filled with people bent at impossible angles, working their separate plots. There's old Wang, who's been farming the same piece of land for 50 years and has passionate opinions about your planting technique that he's happy to share without being asked. There's the Liu family, working together in a synchronized line, their movements coordinated through years of practice and probably a fair amount of unspoken resentment between siblings who never had the option to not work together. There's someone singing a work song, slightly off-key, about love or mountains or possibly a duck. The lyrics get fuzzy after the 20th repetition. The songs help. They give rhythm to the work, transform monotonous physical labor into something almost meditative. These songs are passed down through generations, modified slightly with each telling until nobody remembers the original version or what it was supposed to be about. Some verses don't make sense anymore. References to places that don't exist, people nobody remembers, agricultural techniques that have been obsolete for a century. But it doesn't matter. The song isn't about meaning, it's about filling the silence, sinking movement, making hours pass slightly faster. By midday, the sun is directly overhead, turning the rice paddy into a shimmering mirror that reflects heat upward while the water reflects it from below. You're being cooked from both directions. It's miserable. Everyone agrees it's miserable. Nobody stops working because the rice doesn't care about your comfort. You break for lunch only when the heat becomes genuinely dangerous, when continuing to work risks collapse, and a collapsed farmer is a problem for everyone else who has to drag your unconscious body out of the paddy. Lunch is, predictably, more rice, this time served as actual rice rather than porridge, accompanied by whatever vegetables are in season, maybe stir-fried greens, maybe a soup with tofu, maybe, if it's a special occasion or someone slaughtered a pig recently and distributed shares, there's a small amount of pork. The meat is precious. You don't eat it every day, maybe not even every week. When it appears, it's distributed carefully, ensuring everyone gets a piece, with larger portions going to those doing the hardest physical labor. This isn't generosity. It's practical resource allocation. You eat quickly, sitting in whatever shade you can find. There isn't much. Trees near the paddies are limited because they cast shadows that reduce rice yields, and nobody is willing to sacrifice food production for comfort. So you sit on a raised path between fields, maybe under a small shelter made of bamboo and thatch, and you shovel rice into your mouth while sweat continues to drip from your face into your bowl. You've stopped caring about minor contamination. Everything is already contaminated with mud, sweat, and resignation. After lunch comes the blessed rest period. This happens not because anyone decided you deserve rest, but because working in the full midday sun is an efficient way to die, and dead farmers don't produce rice. So there's an enforced siesta period where everyone retreats to whatever shelter they can find and tries to recover enough to face the afternoon. Some people nap, sprawling on wooden benches or even on the ground if they're tired enough. Others sit and repair tools, mend clothes, or sharpen implements that have dulled from use. Some just stare into the middle distance, contemplating the philosophical question of why rice requires so much attention and whether there's any possible escape from this cycle of planting, growing, harvesting, and planting again. The afternoon brings different work. Maybe you're finished with planting for the day, and now you're tending vegetables in a small plot near your house. Chinese villages are masters of intensive land use. Every available inch of soil gets planted with something. There are vegetables growing in courtyards, along pathways, on hillsides, too steep for rice, in any patch of earth that stays still long enough to receive seeds. Bok choy, Chinese cabbage, long beans climbing bamboo poles, winter melons sprawling across trellises, cucumbers, bitter gourd, amaranth, water spinach, its productive chaos, organized confusion, the kind of efficient land use that comes from centuries of practice and genuine necessity. Or maybe your afternoon involves maintenance work. Everything in the village requires constant maintenance because everything is slowly surrendering to entropy, and you're just trying to negotiate a slower surrender. Roof tiles crack and need replacing. Walls develop gaps where mud plaster has fallen away and needs patching. Irrigation channels silt up and need clearing. Fences lean and need straightening. Tools wear out and need repairing. Clothes tear and need mending. It's endless. The moment you finish fixing everything, the first thing you fixed has broken again. You're not maintaining things, you're just managing the rate of decay. Women have their own elaborate schedule of responsibilities that somehow always seems to involve either water or fire or both. Cooking, obviously, which takes hours because nothing is instant, and every meal starts with raw ingredients that need washing, cutting, and transforming through heat and skill into something edible. Washing clothes, which happens at the river or a communal washing area where women gather with wooden bats and slabs of stone and pound clothing until it's either clean or too exhausted to remain dirty. The washing area is also a social hub. Women gather here not just to clean clothes, but to exchange news, share gossip, compare notes on children, complain about husbands, and discuss whose mother-in-law is being unreasonable this week. The answer is everyone's mother-in-law, but some are more unreasonable than others, and ranking them provides endless entertainment. Then there's textile work. In many villages, women spend evening hours spinning thread or weaving cloth because manufactured fabric is expensive and homemade fabric is just expensive in terms of time rather than money. The spinning wheel sits in the courtyard, clicking away as raw cotton or silk transforms into thread. It's meditative work, the same motion repeated thousands of times. Watching thread appear from shapeless fluff like magic, except slower and requiring actual effort. Some women can spin while walking, while supervising children, while carrying on conversations, while mentally planning tomorrow's meals. It's multitasking before the concept had a name. Children occupy their own separate universe within the village. Very young children are supervised communally. One mother might watch 5 or 6 kids while the others work, with childcare responsibilities rotating through families on a schedule everyone somehow remembers without writing anything down. The children play in alleyways, inventing elaborate games with minimal materials. Stones become pieces in complex games with rules that shift based on who's winning. Sticks become swords, horses, cooking implements, or measuring tools depending on the game in progress. A broken wheel becomes the centerpiece of a competition that somehow involves running, shouting, and accusations of cheating. Older children transition from playing to working, their labor integrated into family operations as soon as they're capable of following instructions and not losing things. They help in the fields, watching water buffalo to ensure they don't wander into neighbors' crops. They scare birds away from ripening rice, using noisemakers and enthusiastic shouting. They carry water from wells, running back and forth with buckets that grow heavier with each trip. They deliver messages between families because there are no phones, and someone needs to tell Auntie Chen that dinner is ready. Education, if it happens at all, takes place in a small village school run by a teacher who may or may not have formal credentials, but definitely has enough classical education to teach children basic literacy. Students ranging from age 6 to 14 crowd into a single room, sitting on wooden benches, practicing characters by writing them repeatedly in sand or on slates. They memorize classical texts, reciting them out loud in a chaotic chorus that somehow works as a teaching method. The 3-character classic, the 1,000-character essay, portions of the analects. They don't fully understand what they're memorizing, but understanding comes later. First comes memorization, As evening approaches, the village begins its slow transformation from work mode to rest mode. People return from fields covered in mud, exhausted, smelling of sweat and earth and livestock. They head to the communal well, where cold water washes away the day's accumulation. The well is the village's evening social hub. Everyone needs water. Everyone comes here. And while they're here anyway, they might as well catch up on what's happened today. The gossip flows as freely as the water. Who's planning to get married? Whose crop looks suspiciously good? And what does that imply about their irrigation practices? Who saw a stranger on the road? And what were they doing here? Who's pregnant again? And didn't they just have a baby last year? Whose mother-in-law said something unforgivable at dinner? And how did the daughter-in-law respond? The social fabric of the village is woven during these casual exchanges. Relationships maintained through shared information and communal judgment. Dinner is the main meal, the time when families gather and eat something more substantial than rice porridge. There's rice, of course, steamed white rice, that forms the foundation of every meal. Rice is so central to the diet that eating and eating rice are synonymous in the language. If you haven't eaten rice, you haven't really eaten at all. Accompanying the rice are several dishes, the exact number depending on the family's prosperity and the season. Stir-fried vegetables, certainly. Whatever's currently growing in the garden, cooked quickly in a hot wok with a bit of oil and salt. Tofu, perhaps, either stir-fried or in soup, providing protein without the expense of meat. Maybe there's fish if someone went fishing recently, or if the village is near enough to a river or pond. Maybe there's a small amount of pork or chicken if it's someone's birthday, if there's a festival approaching, if a pig was recently slaughtered, and portions distributed through the community. The cooking happens in the same smoky kitchen that's been producing smoke since dawn. The wok clangs and hisses as ingredients hit hot oil. Garlic and ginger sizzle and release their aromas. Soy sauce splashes and caramelizes. It's simple food, but it's prepared with the kind of efficiency that comes from cooking the same dishes hundreds of times. Every movement is practiced, automatic. No recipes consulted, because the recipes are memorized, are instinctive, are passed down through watching rather than writing. Families eat together, sitting on small stools arranged around a low table, or sometimes just holding bowls and standing. Chopsticks click against ceramic. People eat quickly, without much ceremony. This isn't fine dining. It's fuel for tomorrow's work. Conversation happens, but it's practical. Who's doing what tomorrow? What needs fixing? Whether the weather looks like rain. There's affection here, but it's expressed through actions rather than words. Making sure everyone has enough to eat. Giving someone the piece of meat. Filling someone's bowl without being asked. After dinner, as darkness settles properly over the village, life enters its evening phase. There's no electricity, so activities are limited by what can be done by candlelight or oil lamp. And since candles and oil cost money, people are conservative with light. You burn a lamp only when necessary, only where work requires it, and you extinguish it the moment you're done. Some families sit in their courtyards, if the weather's pleasant, talking about the day, planning tomorrow, sharing stories everyone has heard before, but nobody minds hearing again. The grandmother might tell a tale about fox spirits who transform into beautiful women and seduce unwary scholars, or about the kitchen god who watches over the household and reports to heaven each year about the family's behavior, or about an ancestor who did something noteworthy generations ago. The children listen, even though they know the stories, because the telling is as important as the tale. And this is how history passes from generation to generation. Others continue working by lamplight. Women sew or spin, their hands moving automatically in the dim light. Men might repair tools, weave baskets from bamboo strips, or carve wooden implements. It's quiet work, meditative work, the kind that lets your mind wander while your hands stay busy. Conversations happen in low voices, punctuated by comfortable silences that nobody feels obligated to fill. The village settles into its particular nighttime quiet, not silent. There are dogs barking somewhere in the distance, chickens making final complaints before sleep, the sound of someone coughing in a nearby house, doors creaking, footsteps shuffling across stone courtyards. But compared to the daytime activity, it's peaceful, almost still. The absence of artificial light means darkness is complete, profound, the kind modern people rarely experience. You can't see your hand in front of your face. The sky, though, fills with stars in quantities and brightness that would shock anyone used to light pollution. Religious and spiritual life weaves through daily existence without fanfare or formality. There's a small temple or shrine somewhere in the village, dedicated to the local earth god or some other deity whose accumulated responsibility for this particular patch of ground. People stop by to burn incense, not necessarily every day, but when they remember or when they need something. Good harvest, healthy children, a favorable marriage arrangement. The gods are approached practically, like officials who might grant requests if properly petitioned. Ancestor worship happens more personally, more privately. Each home has a small altar, often just a shelf mounted on the wall with wooden tablets bearing names of deceased family members written in careful calligraphy. Incense burns here regularly. Offerings of food are placed during festivals. Tea is poured. It's less about grand religious feeling and more about maintaining relationships with family members who happen to no longer be breathing. They're still family. They still deserve respect. They might even still be watching and judging your life choices. Festivals punctuate the agricultural calendar, providing structure and celebration to break up the monotony of work. Spring Festival, the Lunar New Year, is the biggest event of the year. Work stops entirely. Debts are settled. Grievances are theoretically forgiven. Families reunite, with members traveling from wherever they've scattered to return home. There's more food than usual, including dumplings that take hours to make and are consumed in what feels like minutes. Red paper decorations go up everywhere because red is lucky and evil spirits reportedly dislike it. Firecrackers explode at random intervals throughout the celebration, scaring away malevolent forces and also every dog in a 5-mile radius. Children receive red envelopes containing money, small amounts that feel enormous to young hands. Everyone stays up late on New Year's Eve, waiting for the precise moment when the new year arrives, as though catching the transition will somehow make it more real or more lucky. The celebration lasts for days. Families visit back and forth, eating in each house, sharing gossip and updates, comparing children's progress, discussing marriages and business prospects. It's exhausting in a different way than fieldwork is exhausting. Social exhaustion, smile exhaustion. But it's also the most connected people feel all year, the most embedded in the web of relationships that defines village life. Mid-Autumn Festival brings mooncakes, those dense, sweet pastries filled with lotus paste or red bean paste, sometimes with salted egg yolks embedded in the center. They're simultaneously too sweet and too dry, somehow achieving both qualities at once. Families sit outside during the evening, eating mooncakes while admiring the full moon, which is supposed to be at its brightest and most beautiful this night. The moon represents reunion, completeness, family togetherness. It's romantic in theory. In practice, it's mostly people eating slightly too much and complaining that mooncakes are overpriced and not as good as they used to be. Smaller festivals dot the calendar. Qingming, the tomb sweeping festival, when families visit ancestor graves to clean them, leave offerings, and burn paper money for use in the afterlife. Dragon Boat Festival, with its sticky rice dumplings wrapped in bamboo leaves, commemorating an ancient poet who drowned himself in protest and whom fish were supposedly prevented from eating by people throwing rice into the water. Winter solstice, when certain soups must be made or risk bad luck for the entire coming year. The calendar is full of these observances, giving shape to time, marking progress through the year in ways that feel important, even when their original meanings have been forgotten. Social hierarchy exists in the village, but it's less rigidly formal than you might imagine. There's the village head, usually an older man who's either genuinely wise, politically connected, or just good at looking authoritative. He mediates disputes, represents the village to outside authorities, and generally tries to keep things running smoothly enough that nobody higher up in the administrative chain decides to investigate. It's a position of respect, but also responsibility, which makes it less desirable than you'd think. Nobody wants to be responsible when things go wrong. Then there are the wealthy families, or at least wealthy by village standards. They have more land, better houses, the ability to hire workers during busy seasons. They're not rich by city standards, but by local comparison, they're doing well. Everyone knows who they are. Social interactions reflect this knowledge subtly. Who speaks first at village meetings? Whose opinions carry more weight? Who can afford to be generous? And who needs to be careful with resources? Most families occupy the middle ground. Enough land to feed themselves, enough resources to get by, but no real margin for error. One bad harvest, and things get difficult quickly. One serious illness in the family, and the economic calculations change dramatically. So people are careful. They save what they can. They maintain good relationships with neighbors, because mutual assistance is the only insurance policy available. At the bottom are families with little or no land who work other people's fields for wages or shares of the harvest. It's precarious. Hard work with uncertain returns. They're respected for their labor, but pitied for their circumstances. Social mobility exists theoretically, but practically, families tend to stay roughly in the same position generation after generation unless something exceptional happens. Marriage in the village is less about romance and more about practical alliance between families. Matches are arranged based on compatibility of circumstances, similar economic levels, compatible birth dates according to astrological calculation, appropriate family reputations. The young people involved have some input, more than they'd have in stricter traditional arrangements, but less than modern notions of free choice would suggest. They might meet a few times before the wedding. They might exchange letters if both are literate, but mostly they're trusting their families to make reasonable decisions. The wedding itself is elaborate, expensive, and involves enough ritual to keep everyone slightly confused about what's supposed to happen next. There are engagement gifts, betrothal ceremonies, astrological consultations to choose the auspicious date. The bride's family prepares dowry items. The groom's family prepares bride price. Both sides negotiate these exchanges with the intensity of diplomats negotiating treaties, because in a sense that's what's happening. Two families are forming an alliance. The engagement process begins months, or even years before the actual wedding. A matchmaker, usually a professional woman, who knows many families, proposes potential matches. She visits both families, describing each to the other in the most flattering possible terms, while carefully not lying outright about major defects. Her fee depends on successfully arranging marriages, so she's motivated to make matches happen. If both families express interest, they exchange birth dates. Not the young people's birth dates initially, but their parents' permission to exchange birth dates, which itself is a significant step. The birth dates go to an astrologer who calculates compatibility. Are the elements balanced? Do the animal years complement each other? Will the union produce male heirs? The astrologer's analysis can make or break a potential match. If the astrological reading is favorable, formal betrothal begins. The groom's family sends gifts to the bride's family: tea, wine, food items, cloth, sometimes money. The quantity and quality signal the groom family's wealth and seriousness. The bride's family receives these gifts and sends back acceptance gifts, though smaller ones because they're receiving rather than pursuing. Negotiating the bride price and dowry is delicate. The bride price, paid by the groom's family, compensates the bride's family for raising her and for the loss of her labor. The dowry, provided by the bride's family, goes with her to her new home and technically remains hers, though her husband's family controls it practically. Both sides want the exchange to seem balanced while actually trying to advantage themselves. Negotiations can take weeks. Matchmakers earn their fees, navigating these discussions without causing families to lose face or abandon the match. Once bride price and dowry are settled and the auspicious date is chosen, preparations intensify. The bride's family prepares her dowry items: furniture, bedding, clothing, jewelry if they can afford it, household items she'll need. These items will be displayed publicly during the wedding procession, so they must look impressive. Families sometimes borrow items to inflate the apparent dowry because wedding processions are social performances. The groom's family prepares their home for the new arrival. The bride will share a room with her husband, probably not a separate room, but at least a designated sleeping space in the family quarters. This gets cleaned, decorated with red papers bearing auspicious characters, made ready for the couple. Wedding day itself begins before dawn. The bride undergoes elaborate preparation. She's dressed in special red wedding garments, heavily embroidered, far fancier than anything she'll wear again. Her hair is arranged in the married woman style. If she was literate and kept any girlhood writings or drawings, these might be ritually burned to symbolize leaving childhood behind. She cries, or performs crying, to show proper sorrow at leaving her family. Her parents cry, or perform crying to show proper sorrow at losing their daughter. Everyone knows this is performance, but that doesn't make it less meaningful. Meanwhile, the groom dresses in his wedding attire and prepares to travel to the bride's home to claim her. He's accompanied by friends, musicians, and elaborate procession. They carry a sedan chair, enclosed and decorated, which will transport the bride. The distance between homes doesn't matter. Even if the families live next door to each other, the full processional ritual must happen. The groom's group arrives at the bride's home and is initially refused entry. This is ritual. The bride's family makes the groom's party negotiate, pay small gate fees to the bride's younger siblings or cousins, prove their worthy intentions through this playful negotiation. Eventually, they're admitted. The groom performs bows to the bride's ancestors and parents. The bride is formally handed over. She's placed in the sedan chair, which is sealed closed so she can't be seen during transport. The procession from bride's home to groom's home is the most public part of the wedding. The sedan chair is carried by porters. Musicians play loud, festive music. Firecrackers explode to ward off evil spirits. Dowry items are carried in open display, so everyone can see what the bride brings. Villagers line the route, watching, commenting on the dowry, judging whether it's adequate, whether the match seems balanced. Arriving at the groom's home, the bride emerges from the sedan chair and must step over a fire or burning coals, symbolically purifying herself, leaving behind bad luck or evil influences. She enters her new home and immediately performs bows to her husband's ancestors and parents. This is crucial. She's joining their family, accepting their ancestors as her own, subordinating herself to her mother-in-law's authority. The ceremony continues with the couple performing bows to heaven and earth, to ancestors, to parents, and finally to each other. These bows establish the marriage. No document signing, no verbal vows, just ritual bowing that everyone witnesses. Then comes the wedding feast, which is where families demonstrate their wealth and the alliance celebrates publicly. Tables are set up in courtyards or in communal spaces. Food appears in quantities exceeding normal meals by orders of magnitude. Multiple dishes, including expensive items like pork, fish, sometimes duck. Wine flows freely. Guests eat, drink, talk loudly, celebrate the union. The couple sits at the head table, but doesn't eat much. They're too nervous, too observed, too aware that everyone is watching and judging. They're performing their new roles as married people for the first time in public. After the feast, there might be games, testing the couple's compatibility through mildly embarrassing challenges, making them cooperate to complete tasks, asking them questions, seeing how they interact. It's entertainment for guests and evaluation for families. On the wedding day, the bride leaves her family home in a decorated sedan chair, crying to demonstrate proper filial sadness at leaving her parents. The crying is mostly ceremonial. Everyone understands this. She's carried to the groom's family home, where she'll now live, becoming the newest and lowest ranking member of his family. This is not an enviable position. Young brides have it rough. They're expected to serve their mother-in-law, do the hardest household work, prove their worth through obedience and silence, and eventually through producing sons, many sons. The relationship between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law is famously tense, the subject of countless stories, plays, and knowing glances. It's a power dynamic that only resolves when the daughter-in-law eventually becomes a mother-in-law herself, at which point she often perpetuates exactly the same behavior she once suffered through. Healthcare in the village combines practical knowledge accumulated over generations, herbal medicine with varying degrees of effectiveness, and hope. When someone gets sick, you first try home remedies, ginger tea for upset stomach, specific herbs for fever, certain soups for weakness. These treatments work sometimes, often enough to maintain credibility. When they don't work, you try something else. For serious illness, there might be a traveling doctor who visits the village periodically, practicing traditional medicine with herbs, acupuncture, and diagnostic techniques involving pulse reading and tongue examination. Or someone might make the long journey to town to seek medical help. Though this costs money and outcomes are uncertain, many people are cautious about seeking medical care because the treatment might be as dangerous as the illness. Childbirth is especially dangerous. Women help other women through the process, drawing on accumulated experience and traditional practices. Most births proceed normally. When they don't, the consequences can be severe. Losing mothers in childbirth is common enough that it's not shocking, just sad. Infant mortality is high. Families expect to lose some children. They hope they won't. They try to prevent it, but they expect it. It's a grim statistical reality that nobody talks about openly, but everyone understands. As night deepens and the village grows truly quiet, families prepare for sleep. The day has been long, physically exhausting, in ways that make falling asleep easy. You lie down on your firm bed, pull a cotton quilt over yourself, and surrender to fatigue. In winter, you pile on extra quilts, wear extra clothing, and still feel cold. In summer, you use minimal covering, open doors, and windows for airflow, and still feel hot. Comfort is relative. The sounds of night are different from day. Crickets chirp in rhythmic waves that somehow become soothing rather than annoying. Somewhere a baby cries briefly, then stops. A dog barks once, twice, then settles. The wind moves through bamboo with a soft rustling sound that's almost musical. It's dark in a way that modern people rarely experience. True darkness, complete darkness, the kind where your eyes stay open or closed and see exactly the same amount of nothing. But it's familiar darkness, safe darkness. You're surrounded by family, by neighbors, by the village that's been here longer than anyone can remember. There's comfort in that continuity, that sense of being part of something larger than yourself, older than your lifetime, likely to continue after you're gone. And so, you sleep. Tomorrow will bring the same routine, the same rooster announcement at dawn, the same breakfast, the same work in fields or home, the same evening conversations, the same gradual settling into darkness, day after day, season after season, year after year. It's repetitive, it's predictable, it's, in many ways, boring. But boring has its own kind of peace. There's no existential crisis about life purpose when your purpose is obvious. Survive. Help your family survive. Contribute to the village community. Honor your ancestors. Raise children who will do the same. It's simple, not easy, certainly not easy, but simple. The village exists in a kind of timeless bubble. Yes, dynasties rise and fall in distant capitals. Emperors change. Wars happen somewhere beyond the horizon. But here, in this small village, between rice paddies and hills, Life continues in its ancient rhythm. The same crops, the same festivals, the same stories told by lamplight. Occasionally the outside world intrudes. A merchant passes through with news from the provincial capital. A young man leaves to seek his fortune in the city and returns years later with strange clothes and stranger ideas. A new tax is announced or a new regulation, and the village adjusts slowly, reluctantly, the way a tree bends in wind but keeps growing. But mostly, the village is its own world, self-contained, self-sufficient. The rest of existence might as well be on the moon, for all the daily impact it has. You know the name of every family. You've known them your entire life. Your parents knew their parents. Your children will know their children. This web of relationships, obligations, and shared history is thicker than blood, stronger than any formal institution. There's comfort in that rootedness, even if it comes with constraints. You can't just leave. You can't reinvent yourself. You are who you are, where you are, doing what generations before you did. Some find this suffocating. Others find it liberating in its certainty. The village comes together as a single unit for major events. When someone builds a new house, everyone helps. When someone's harvest fails, neighbors share what they can spare. When there's a wedding or funeral, the entire village participates. These aren't optional. They're collective responsibilities, and through them, the village maintains its identity as something more than just individual households. Community is strong because it must be. There's no alternative, no social services, no government assistance, no insurance companies. You have family and neighbors. Together you survive or you don't. So, you maintain good relationships. You help when help is needed, knowing you'll need help eventually. You participate in communal events. You contribute to collective efforts. You don't have much choice, but the lack of choice creates a different kind of freedom. Freedom from isolation. Freedom from doubt about whether people will be there when you need them. Disputes happen, of course. Arguments about property boundaries, water rights, wandering livestock, inappropriate comments, perceived slights. These get resolved through mediation by elders, community pressure, and eventual grudging acceptance. Holding grudges is exhausting when you see the person every day for the rest of your life. Better to find accommodation. The village has its characters, the personalities that give it texture and life. Old Wang, who tells the same stories about his youth every single time, embellishing them slightly more with each retelling. The Liu family twins who are identical and use this to their advantage in ways ranging from harmless pranks to slightly questionable business practices. Widow Jiang, who makes the best preserved vegetables in 3 provinces and knows it and will tell you about it. The Chen boy, who's too clever for his own good and will either become very successful or end up in serious trouble. These personalities make the village feel alive rather than just functional. They're the subject of gossip, the source of entertainment, occasional sources of annoyance. But they're your gossip, your entertainment, your annoyance. There's possessive fondness to it. They're yours in the way family is yours, whether you chose them or not. Religious life continues quietly, practically. Incense burns at the temple. Prayers are murmured before ancestor tablets. Amulets are worn to ward off bad luck. It's all very casual, very practical. You don't have deep theological discussions about the nature of divinity or the meaning of existence. You just acknowledge that forces beyond human control exist, and it's probably wise to stay on their good side. The gods are numerous and specialized. Kitchen God watches your cooking and reports annually to heaven about your behavior. Door gods guard your entrance against evil influences. Earth God manages local affairs like harvests and weather. Then there are bigger deities, Buddhist bodhisattvas and Taoist immortals, whose jurisdiction is less clear, but who probably appreciate offerings anyway. It's a crowded spiritual landscape, but nobody seems confused about who to pray to for what. Superstition guide behavior in ways ranging from harmless to genuinely limiting. Do not cut your hair during the first month of the Lunar New Year, or you'll cut off your luck. Don't whistle at night, or you'll attract ghosts. Pregnant women shouldn't attend funerals. The number 4 sounds like death, so it's avoided. The number 8 sounds like prosperity, so it's preferred. Red is lucky. White is for funerals. Broken mirrors mean bad luck. Sweeping during New Year sweeps away your fortune. These rules accumulate over generations. Nobody remembers their origins. Nobody questions their validity too directly. Everyone follows them with varying degrees of seriousness. Because why take chances if avoiding something costs you nothing and might prevent misfortune, even unlikely misfortune? Why not avoid it? As seasons turn, the village landscape transforms. Spring brings green shoots, pushing through water in paddies. Trees flowering, everything awakening. Summer turns everything lush and humid and almost aggressively alive. The hills covered in dense vegetation, insects buzzing, heat pressing down. Autumn brings harvest, the golden rice cut and dried and bundled. Satisfaction of stored food. Preparation for winter. Winter strips trees bare, turns everything brown and gray and quiet, forces everyone to huddle near fires and wait for spring. Each season has its rhythm, its requirements, its mood. Spring is hopeful and busy with planting. Summer is growth and constant maintenance. Autumn is harvest and relief. Winter is rest and endurance. The cycle repeats, has repeated for centuries, will repeat for centuries more probably, unless something dramatic changes. But change comes slowly to these villages. A new crop variety introduced, a better tool designed, a road improved incrementally. These changes accumulate over decades, over centuries. But in any given year, life looks remarkably similar to the previous year. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the goal isn't progress or innovation or disruption. Maybe the goal is continuity, stability, preservation of a way of life that works, more or less, for the people living it. It's not perfect, it's often hard, but it's sustainable in ways many modern systems are not. So tonight, as we imagine this traditional Chinese village settling into sleep, we can appreciate what it represents. Not romantic nostalgia for a simpler time, because these times weren't simple. They were hard, but perhaps appreciation for a different kind of life, one measured in seasons and harvests rather than quarters and fiscal years, one where your place in the world is certain, even if that certainty comes with limitations, one where community is unavoidable, inescapable, and ultimately sustaining. The village sleeps now, families in their courtyard homes, children nestled against parents, grandparents breathing slowly in corners. The rooster will wake them at dawn. The whole cycle will begin again. Rice porridge, fields, maintenance, gossip, dinner, darkness, sleep, day after day after day. And in that repetition, in that predictable rhythm, there's peace. Not exciting peace, not entertaining peace, just boring peace. The peace of knowing what tomorrow brings, the peace of routine, the peace of a life lived within boundaries, set by generations past and accepted by generations present, which is exactly what we came here for tonight. But before we let the village fade completely into sleep, let's linger a bit longer on some details that deserve their own attention. Because village life, boring as it might seem from the outside, contains layers of complexity and ritual that make it endlessly fascinating once you look closely. Let's talk about water, because water management in a traditional Chinese village is serious business, not the turn on a tap kind of simple. We're talking about water that must be carried, stored, protected, and shared through systems developed over generations. The village well is not just a hole in the ground with water at the bottom. It's a carefully constructed structure lined with stones or bricks, with a pulley system for lowering buckets, and often covered with a roof to keep debris out. The well is communally owned, communally maintained, and subject to elaborate social rules about usage. Morning is prime water drawing time. Everyone needs water for washing, cooking, and livestock. There's an informal but strictly observed order to who draws when. Households take turns. Nobody monopolizes the well. If you try to draw water out of turn or take more than your reasonable share, you'll hear about it. Not immediately, not confrontationally, but through indirect comments and social pressure that makes your transgression clear without requiring direct confrontation. The water itself is considered precious. Nothing is wasted. Water used for washing vegetables gets reused for watering plants. Water used for washing rice gets fed to pigs, who apparently enjoy the starchy residue. Water that's been used once, but is still relatively clean, gets used again for something less demanding. The concept of pouring perfectly good water onto the ground would seem wasteful to the point of moral failure. During dry seasons, water becomes even more critical. Wells might run low, springs might slow to trickles, irrigation channels might need to be carefully managed to ensure everyone's fields get adequate water. Disputes over water rights can become serious. They're mediated carefully because water conflicts can tear communities apart faster than almost anything else. Some villages have Feng Shui ponds, carefully positioned bodies of water that serve multiple purposes. They store water for irrigation and firefighting. They raise fish for food. They moderate local temperature slightly, and they fulfill Feng Shui requirements for balanced elements. The pond might be home to carp, those large ornamental fish that live for decades and become almost like village mascots. Children feed them. Adults consult their behavior for weather predictions. If the carp are jumping, rain is coming. If they're staying deep, drought continues. Whether this works or is just confirmation bias doesn't matter. Everyone believes it. Now, let's consider the village's relationship with markets, because even self-sufficient villages must engage with the broader economy. Market day, which might happen every few days or once a week depending on the region, transforms the village temporarily. Early in the morning, even earlier than usual, farmers prepare products for market. Vegetables are bundled. Eggs are carefully packed in baskets padded with straw. Live chickens get their legs tied together in pairs and loaded into baskets. Whatever craft items or handmade goods the family produces get prepared for transport. Everything gets loaded onto carrying poles, those flexible wooden poles that balance loads suspended from each end, or onto carts if the family has one, or onto backs if they don't. The journey to market might be short, or might take hours, depending on where the market town is. People walk in groups for safety and companionship. The pre-dawn walk to market is social time. News gets exchanged, plans get made, marriages get discussed, business partnerships get proposed. By the time you reach the market, you've already conducted half your social business for the day. The market itself is controlled chaos. Hundreds of people from surrounding villages converge, each trying to sell what they have and buy what they need. There's a section for vegetables, a section for meat, a section for cloth and clothing, a section for tools and implements, a section for everything else. The noise is overwhelming. Everyone is shouting, advertising their goods, negotiating prices, greeting friends, arguing about quality. Prices aren't fixed. Everything is negotiable. Haggling is expected, required, almost ritualistic. The seller quotes a price that's higher than they expect to receive. The buyer offers less than they're willing to pay. They meet somewhere in the middle through a process that involves theatrical outrage, wounded pride, appeals to long friendship, comparisons to other vendors, and eventually grudging agreement. Both parties pretend to be slightly unhappy with the final price, which means it's probably fair. You sell what you brought, hopefully. Sometimes prices are lower than expected. Sometimes nobody wants what you're selling. Sometimes you have to bring items home and try again next market day. You buy what you need. Salt, always. You can't make salt, so you must buy it. Maybe oil for cooking or lamps. Maybe a tool that needs replacing. Maybe cloth if someone needs new clothes. Maybe a small luxury if money permits. A bit of candy for the children. Some tea slightly better than what you usually drink. Lunch happens at market, usually at one of the food stalls that's set up specifically for market day. Noodles, probably. A big bowl of noodles and broth with some vegetables and maybe a bit of meat if you're feeling prosperous. It's a treat, eating food someone else cooked, sitting on a bench, watching the market chaos swirl around you. You eat quickly because time is money and you need to finish your business and get home before dark. The walk home is different from the morning walk. You're tired. You're carrying whatever you purchased. You're mentally calculating whether the day was profitable. Some days are good, some days less so, but market day is necessary, the interface between your small village world and the larger economy. Back in the village, let's talk about festivals in more detail because they deserve it. We mentioned the major festivals earlier, but there are numerous smaller observances that mark the calendar and provide structure to the year. The Lantern Festival, 15 days after Lunar New Year, marks the official end of New Year celebrations. Paper lanterns in elaborate shapes, fish, rabbits, dragons, flowers, get hung everywhere. Children carry lanterns on poles, parading through the village as darkness falls. Riddles are written on lanterns. Solving them is a game that combines literacy, cleverness, and cultural knowledge. Sweet rice balls filled with sesame paste or sweet bean paste are eaten. They're called tang yuan, and they're symbolic of family reunion and completeness. Cold Food Festival happens in early spring, a day when cooking fires are not lit. All food is prepared the day before and eaten cold. It commemorates an ancient, loyal minister who died in a fire. Practically, It gives everyone a break from the constant work of maintaining cooking fires. People visit ancestor tombs, clean them, make offerings. The day after Cold Food Festival is Qingming, when the graves get even more attention and families have picnics near ancestral burial sites, combining remembrance with socializing. Dragon Boat Festival in the 5th lunar month brings not just rice dumplings, but also dragon boat races, if the village is near water suitable for racing. Long boats carved with dragon heads, filled with rowers, compete, while drums pound rhythm and spectators cheer. The festival supposedly commemorates the poet Ku Yuan, who drowned himself, but really it's an excuse for community gathering, competition, and eating triangular, sticky rice packages wrapped in bamboo leaves. 7th day of the 7th month is the Chinese Valentine's Day, celebrating the legend of the cowherd and weaver girl, star-crossed lovers separated by the Milky Way who can meet only once a year. Young women display their needlework skills. Offerings get made to the weaver girl for dexterity in handicrafts. It's romantic in a highly structured, traditional way. Mid-Autumn Festival we mentioned, with its mooncakes and moon viewing, but there's more to it. Children parade with lanterns. Families arrange tables outside with offerings to the moon, fruits, incense, flowers. The full moon represents family completeness. Being able to view it together is considered fortunate. Being separated from family during this festival is melancholy. Winter solstice is significant, marking the longest night. After this day, daylight slowly increases. It's considered a semi-major festival. Families eat special foods, usually tang yuan again, those rice balls and sweet soup. Making them together is family bonding time. Eating them symbolizes adding a year to your age. Then there are the kitchen god's annual journey. On the 23rd day of the 12th lunar month, the kitchen god, who's been watching your family all year, returns to heaven to report on your behavior. Families smear honey on the kitchen god's image, so his report will be sweet, or sticky his mouth shut, so he can't report bad things, or some combination of both. New Year's Eve, he returns and gets a new image to watch over the kitchen for another year. These festivals aren't just celebrations. They're the social glue holding the community together. The regular occasions that force even feuding families to participate in communal activities. The markers that structure time in memorable ways. Let's discuss clothing more thoroughly, because what you wear in a traditional village isn't fashion, it's function, with some cultural signaling mixed in. Men's typical clothing consists of a loose jacket with buttons or ties, worn over loose trousers. The fabric is usually cotton, homespun, and hand-woven if the family produces their own, purchased at market if they don't. Colors are typically dark, blue, gray, black, because these colors don't show dirt as readily, and dyes in these shades are cheaper and more readily available. The jacket might have a side opening or a front opening, depending on regional style. Pants are loose, comfortable for working, tied at the waist with a cloth sash. On feet, cloth shoes with thick, padded soles. They're not waterproof, they're not particularly durable, but they're what's available and affordable. Wealthy farmers might have leather boots for winter. Poor farmers might go barefoot much of the year, shoes being reserved for special occasions and cold weather. For head covering, men might wear a cloth cap or simply go bareheaded depending on season and personal preference. The cap serves multiple purposes, keeps sun off in summer, provides warmth in winter, signals that you're a respectable adult rather than a child or vagrant. Women's clothing follows similar principles, but with more complexity. A loose jacket worn over a long skirt or, in some regions, loose trousers. The jacket typically buttons or ties on the right side, this being traditional Chinese styling. Colors might be slightly more varied than men's clothing, but still tend toward practical darker shades. Aprons are essential. You're cooking over open fires, carrying children, doing messy agricultural work. The apron protects your clothing and provides pockets for carrying things. Some aprons are decorative, embroidered during winter evenings when there's time for such work. The embroidery shows your skill, your family's prosperity, your eye for design. Hair for women is always worn up once they're married. Long hair is braided or coiled and pinned at the back of the head. Unmarried girls can wear braids down their backs. Married women must wear their hair up. It's a clear social signal. Hair ornaments range from simple wooden pins to elaborate silver pieces, depending on wealth and occasion. Foot binding was practiced in some regions, transforming women's feet into small, deformed triangles that were considered beautiful and that made walking difficult. Not every village practiced foot binding. Farming communities often didn't because women needed to work, and bound feet made work nearly impossible. But in some areas, even farming families bound daughters' feet to improve marriage prospects, condemning them to lifetime pain for social advancement. Clothing gets worn until it's literally falling apart. Then it gets patched, then patched again, then cut down and made into smaller items for children, then used as rags, then possibly burned for warmth. Nothing is wasted. The idea of throwing away clothing with wear left in it would seem insane. New clothes are made for New Year, if possible. This is significant. Starting the year with new clothes is lucky and shows proper respect for the occasion. If you can't afford entirely new outfits, at least get new shoes or new outer garments. Or at minimum, thoroughly wash and mend everything you have. Let's talk about the village's relationship with government, because even remote villages exist within larger administrative structures. The county magistrate is the local representative of imperial authority, though he might be days away in the county seat. His concerns are taxes, legal disputes, too serious for village mediation, criminal matters, and general maintenance of order. He has runners and clerks who periodically visit villages, usually to collect taxes or investigate problems. Tax collection is serious business. Agricultural tax is based on land holdings. There might be other taxes, labor service requirements, special levies for military campaigns, salt tax, commercial taxes if you're engaging in trade. The exact burden varies by dynasty, by emperor, by how corrupt local officials are, by how well connected your region is. Tax payments might be in grain, in silver, in labor service, or some combination. When tax collectors come, it's tense. Everyone wants to pay enough to avoid trouble, but not so much that they're being cheated. The collectors want to extract maximum payment to meet their quotas and take their cut. Negotiations happen, arguments happen, sometimes beatings happen if payments are severely delinquent. The village head serves as intermediary between village and government. He's responsible for ensuring taxes get paid, criminals get reported, government orders get communicated. It's a difficult position. Serve the government too enthusiastically, and your fellow villagers resent you. Serve the villagers too well, and government authorities punish you. The successful village head walks this line carefully, appearing compliant to government while protecting village interests where possible. Legal disputes within the village get mediated locally if possible. The village head, respected elders, heads of major families, they form an informal council that hears disputes and proposes solutions. The goal is harmony restoration rather than punishment. If you have a dispute with your neighbor, mediation seeks a solution you can both live with, because you're going to remain neighbors for the rest of your lives. Serious crimes, murder, major theft, rebellion, those go to the magistrate. His justice is harsh. Punishments include beatings, exile, execution. The legal system is not designed around concepts like innocence until proven guilty or right to counsel. It's designed around maintaining order and extracting confessions. Torture is standard investigative practice. Being involved with the legal system, even as a witness, is something everyone tries to avoid. Military service is another government demand. When armies need soldiers, they requisition them from villages. Being drafted is not optional. You go, you serve, you might never return. Families of soldiers might receive small stipends, might not. If your son or husband gets drafted, you try to continue surviving without his labor, hoping he comes back. Now let's discuss what happens when things go wrong. Because life in a traditional village is precarious in ways modern existence isn't. Drought means crop failure, means hunger. The village has storage, hopefully grain from previous good harvests, stored in elevated granaries to keep it dry and away from rats. But storage is limited. A single-year drought is manageable. Multi-year drought is catastrophic. During famine, the social order phrase, families share less. Petty theft increases. People eat things that aren't normally food. Tree bark, grass, clay, mixed with grain husks to make the stomach feel full. Migration might happen. Families abandoning their homes to seek food elsewhere. Becoming refugees hoping for charity or work. Flooding is equally disastrous. Too much water destroys crops just as thoroughly as too little. Floods also destroy homes, contaminate wells, spread disease. After floods, there's reconstruction work, replanting if season permits, hoping next year is better. Disease outbreaks terrify villages. Cholera from contaminated water, smallpox spreading person to person, various fevers that might be malaria or typhoid or any number of illnesses that traditional medicine can't effectively treat. When epidemic disease arrives, families isolate sick members, villages might quarantine themselves, everyone burns incense and prays and hopes the plague passes. Bandits are another danger. During unstable times, dynastic transitions, major famines, wars, some men turn to banditry. Organized groups roam the countryside, raiding villages for food, valuables, anything portable. Villages might organize militia defenses. Watchtowers get manned. Able-bodied men train with agricultural implements converted to weapons. Usually bandits prefer easier targets. Usually, fire is a constant fear. Houses made of wood and thatch, cooking fires burning constantly, oil lamps and candles for lighting, everything is flammable. One fire can destroy multiple homes before it's contained. Villages organize firefighting responses. Everyone helps. Bucket brigades form from the well to the fire. Homes near the fire get demolished to create fire breaks. It's community survival in action. When disaster strikes, The community response reveals its fundamental character. Successful villages pull together, share resources, help rebuild. Failing villages fragment, the social contract breaking under stress. Let's talk about childhood in more detail because being a child in a traditional village is both simpler and more complex than modern childhood. Infants are carried everywhere, strapped to mothers' backs with long cloth wrappings that keep them secure while leaving mothers' hands free for work. They learn to sleep through noise, activity, and jostling because there's no other choice. Babies who can't adapt don't thrive. Weaning happens when the next pregnancy occurs, or when the child is around 2 or 3 years old. It's not gentle, it's practical separation. The child must learn to eat rice porridge and other foods because mother's milk is needed elsewhere. Young children, from toddler age to maybe 5 or 6, have remarkable freedom. They roam in packs, supervised loosely by whoever's nearby. They play traditional games passed down through generations. Hide and seek, though called different names. Tag in various forms. Elaborate imaginative games involving sticks, stones, and complicated narratives. They're learning social skills, learning physical capability, learning the village geography. Around age 6 or 7, gender roles become more defined and work expectations begin. Boys start following fathers and older brothers, learning agricultural work, animal husbandry, and whatever craft or trade the family practices. Girls stay closer to mothers and grandmothers, learning household management, cooking, sewing, and textile work. This isn't gentle learning. It's learned by doing. You're taught once, maybe twice, then expected to perform. Mistakes bring criticism, sometimes punishment. Successful performance brings acknowledgement, but rarely praise. You're expected to contribute to family welfare as soon as you're capable. Education, for those who receive it, means memorization primarily. Classical texts, moral precepts, practical mathematics. The goal isn't critical thinking, it's cultural transmission. Learn what previous generations learned. Maintain continuity. For most village children, formal education is limited or non-existent. Literacy is valuable, but not essential for agricultural work. Many children grow up illiterate, learning only what they need for their expected roles. Adolescence isn't recognized as a separate life stage. You're a child, then you're an adult. The transition might be marked by beginning full work responsibility, by betrothal, by physical maturation, but there's no teenage phase of identity exploration and rebellion. Marriage happens young, often mid to late teens for girls, slightly older for boys. This isn't romantic, it's practical. Get married, start producing the next generation, contribute to family labor pool. Old age, if you reach it, brings both respect and vulnerability. Elderly people are honored for their experience and wisdom. They're consulted on important decisions. Their stories are heard, but they're also dependent on younger generations for physical support. The quality of your old age depends on how well you raised your children and how well they're willing to support you now. The truly elderly, those who reach their 70s or beyond, are considered blessed by heaven. They're celebrated. Their birthdays become village events. They're living proof that your family has good fortune, good genes, good feng shui. When they die, their funerals are elaborate celebrations of a long life well lived. Funerals deserve their own discussion because death rituals in traditional villages are complex and socially crucial. When someone dies, The family immediately begins mourning protocols that will last for extended periods. The body is washed, dressed in special burial clothing, and placed in a coffin that the family hopefully had prepared years in advance, because having your coffin ready is considered practical planning, not morbid. The coffin stays in the home for several days while family members gather, including those who've moved away. Mourning clothes, white rather than black, in Chinese tradition, get worn. Wailing and grieving are expected, demonstrative sadness showing proper respect for the deceased. A funeral procession eventually carries the coffin to the burial site. The entire village participates. Mourners walk in order of relationship closeness. Professional mourners might be hired to ensure adequate wailing. Musicians play, incense burns, paper money and paper goods get burned to provide the deceased with resources in the afterlife. The burial site is chosen carefully according to Feng Shui principles. The wrong location might doom descendants to bad fortune. Families hire geomancers to select proper sites and auspicious times for burial. After burial, mourning continues. Immediate family wears white for a period that varies with relationship closeness. Deepest mourning is for parents, traditionally 3 years, though practically often shortened. During mourning, you avoid celebrations, wear plain clothing, observe restrictions on behavior. Death anniversaries get observed annually with offerings at the grave and at the home altar. The deceased transitions from recently departed to honored ancestor, joining the generations who watch over and protect the family. Now, as the village continues its deep sleep and our journey through traditional Chinese village life approaches its natural end, let's reflect on what we've explored. We've walked through a day, through a year, through a lifetime, in a place where time moves differently than in our modern rushed world, where change is measured in generations rather than quarterly reports, where innovation means improving ancient practices slightly rather than disrupting everything. This life we've examined is hard. No romanticism can obscure that. The work is physical, relentless, sometimes literally backbreaking. Medical care is limited and often ineffective. Infant mortality is high. Life expectancy is short. Opportunities for individual advancement are severely constrained. Personal freedom is sacrificed to collective needs. And yet, there's something here that modern life has lost. A rootedness, a certainty about your place in the world. A web of relationships so dense and strong that isolation is impossible even when you might want it. A rhythm aligned with natural cycles rather than artificial schedules. Work that's hard but meaningful, producing tangible results you can see and touch and eat. The village sleeps, has been sleeping for hours now. The deep darkness of night surrounds everything. Stars wheel overhead, marking time in their ancient patterns. Inside courtyard homes, families sleep together, generations sharing space and warmth, breathing synchronized, dreams happening in quiet privacy. The rooster will wake them soon. Well, not soon. Hours still remain before dawn, but eventually, inevitably, the rooster will announce the sun's return. The cycle will continue. Rice porridge will be made. Fields will call for attention. Water will be carried. Food will be cooked. Work will be worked. Conversations will be had. Gossip will be shared. Children will play and learn. Elders will advise. Animals will be tended. Repairs will be made. Meals will be eaten. Darkness will fall. Sleep will come. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. The same basic pattern, repeating with minor variations. It's predictable. It's boring. It's stable. It's sustainable. It's a life lived in common with others, accountable to community, embedded in tradition, constrained by custom, and somehow, despite all the constraints, complete. This is what we came here to experience. Not excitement, not novelty, not stimulation, but this deep, abiding, ancient boring peace. The peace of routine, the peace of knowing your place, the peace of repetition, the peace of a life that would put modern productivity experts to sleep within minutes, but that sustained billions of humans for thousands of years. The village sleeps now. Let it sleep. Let it rest in its timeless rhythm, undisturbed by our brief visit, continuing its ancient patterns long after we've returned to our electric lights and running water and temperature-controlled environments and isolated bedrooms. Let the village sleep. Let the rice grow. Let the seasons turn. Let generations follow generations. Let the boring, beautiful pattern continue, and let us, visiting this village in imagination, finally surrender to the peace we came seeking. Sleep well.